had always liked the idea of escaping the city. The constant noise, the people rushing around, the endless notifications and calls. It all felt like a trap I couldn't step out of. So when I found a small cabin for rent online, tucked deep into a forest that wasn't too far from my town, I jumped on it. The pictures looked perfect. A rustic log cabin with a small porch, surrounded by towering pine and birch trees. There was a creek nearby, and the listing promised complete isolation. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, just the kind of solitude I thought I needed to breathe. I packed lightly, a few changes of clothes, a thick jacket, some canned food, a portable stove, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I didn't bother bringing a tent. The cabin itself would be enough. The drive took longer than I expected because the directions were vague, winding through narrow, unpaved roads. At one point, I had to stop and check the GPS, only to find it losing signal completely. I cursed quietly, but something about it made me even more excited, the feeling of being completely cut off. Finally, after hours of driving through winding dirt tracks and thick woods, I saw it. The cabin, small and unassuming, sitting in a clearing with a light layer of moss on its roof and smoke rising faintly from the chimney. For a moment, I hesitated. The isolation hit me all at once, and I realized I was truly alone. Not a single car passed on the road behind me. Not a single person was visible anywhere. The cabin was sturdier than it looked online. I pushed open the door, and the smell of aged wood mixed with a faint mildew hit me. It had been empty for a while, but it wasn't unpleasant. Dust covered the furniture, and a few dead leaves had blown in through the slightly cracked windows, but everything seemed intact. There was a small kitchen, a wood stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a tiny bathroom with a shower that I assumed still worked. I set my bags down and walked around, touching the walls, inspecting the locks. Everything felt solid. I opened one of the windows and breathed in the cold, pine-scented air. The silence was intense. Not a bird, not a rustle, nothing. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor near the stove. I wasn't planning to use the bed. Something about the floor with a warm stove next to me felt safer, more controlled. I spent the first afternoon chopping firewood from a stack behind the cabin. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of control. I liked being able to see the physical effort I was putting into surviving here for a few days. By the time the sun began to set, I had a fire going in the stove, enough to warm the cabin, and I felt proud. I heated a can of soup and ate slowly, listening to the faint crackle of the flames. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The sounds of the daytime, birds, insects, faded. In their place, there was a low, constant hum. The wind brushing through the trees, the branches creaking. I was on edge but told myself it was normal. I reminded myself I had been alone in the woods before, during short hikes, and this wasn't any different, just longer. Night came fully, and I realized I had no cell signal. I checked my phone multiple times, hoping for a bar or two, but it stayed dead. My heart rate quickened a little. Being isolated like this changes the mind in small ways. Every shadow looked deeper, every sound more deliberate. I tried to read, but I couldn't concentrate. The wind picked up outside, and the thin walls of the cabin rattled. I forced myself to sleep near the stove, the warmth giving me a sense of safety. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch hitting the cabin, but the sound repeated. Sharp, deliberate scratches coming from outside. My first instinct was to ignore it, but it kept going closer this time. I sat up and turned on my flashlight, pointing it toward the windows. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. The scratching stopped abruptly. I stayed awake for hours, fire flickering, flashlight nearby, imagining all sorts of scenarios. Animals, people, the impossibility of being alone, but nothing appeared. By dawn, I was exhausted, nerves raw. The next day, I decided to explore the surroundings. The creek wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk through a narrow path lined with dense trees. I filled my water bottles and marked the path in my mind so I could return easily. The forest was beautiful, deceptively peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines, creating patterns on the ground. The creek gurgled pleasantly, birds called faintly, and I tried to convince myself that yesterday's noises were just imagination. But something was off. Broken branches in patterns, footprints that weren't mine, maybe deer, maybe human. Couldn't tell. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, chopping more wood as the sky dimmed. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more confident. It seemed to circle the cabin, moving from side to side, then stopping. I watched through the windows for hours. There was nothing. My mind raced. There's a difference between imagining danger and observing it. My muscles were tight. Adrenaline ran through me. I set up heavy furniture near the doors and windows, just in case. Sleep was impossible. The third day, I stayed inside most of the time. I rationed food and water, making the fire last longer. The scratches were relentless at night. I couldn't tell if it was one animal or multiple. I considered leaving, but my car was several miles away on a road I hadn't fully memorized. Panic started to set in. By night, the noises escalated. It wasn't just scratching anymore. Something was pushing against the cabin walls, slow, heavy pressure, as if testing the structure. I held my flashlight tight, listening to every movement, sweat running down my spine. The air inside the cabin felt heavy. My mind was slipping toward fear I hadn't known before, primitive, raw, and consuming. At some point, I realized the cabin had weaknesses. The back door was old, the lock rusty. The windows, though thick, rattled when pressed. I barricaded the doors with every piece of furniture I could move. I had my knife, a hammer, and a heavy cast iron pan within reach. When the pressure on the walls started again, I shouted at it, even though I knew no one could hear me. The sound faded, leaving only the wind, or what I hoped was the wind. By the fourth day, I hadn't slept properly. My food was low, the firewood almost gone. I realized something. I had been imagining, misinterpreting sounds. I had been alone, but my mind had created a threat, fueled by isolation, exhaustion, and fear. And yet, a small voice inside me, a logical one, reminded me that there was also a chance something could be real. I couldn't ignore either possibility. I had to act. I had to leave the cabin. To first light, I packed quickly. I left no trace except the smoke rising from the chimney that would soon fade. I took the narrow trail toward the road, marking it carefully. Every shadow seemed to follow me, every noise exaggerated by my nerves. Branches snapped underfoot, and once, a large deer bolted in front of me, causing my heart to leap. But I stayed focused. After several hours, I reached the main dirt road. Relief hit me in waves. I could see the faint outline of my car parked by a curve, half hidden by trees. I drove slowly at first, constantly glancing at the treeline. It felt surreal to be back on the open road, even though it was just a dirt path. The cabin, now far behind me, disappeared among the trees. I realized I would never forget it. Not the fear, but the feeling of utter isolation, the way my mind had betrayed me, how the silence of the forest could be louder than a city full of people. Weeks later, I told myself it had been an important lesson. Isolation has power, even in places that seem safe. Humans are not meant to be cut off completely, and fear can manifest from nothing if the mind is left unchecked. I didn't go back to the cabin, and I never will. I learned how fragile I was, how quickly comfort could turn into terror, and how small and powerless one feels against the overwhelming scale of nature. I still dream about that cabin sometimes, not about ghosts or creatures, but about the weight of being completely alone, with nothing but your own thoughts and fears pressing in. The forest remains indifferent to human presence, and sometimes that indifference feels far more terrifying than any conscious threat. I understood then that survival wasn't about fighting monsters. It was about controlling yourself, your fear, and your decisions. And when I finally returned to the city, I carried that knowledge with me, a quiet reminder that even a small, isolated cabin in the woods can teach lessons about fear, reality, and resilience that no classroom ever could. I had been looking forward to this cabin trip for months. Life in the city had worn me down. Endless noise, relentless work, the constant pressure to be on time, to be productive, to keep moving. I needed a break. I wanted the quiet, the isolation, the kind of peace you can only find somewhere deep in the woods where no one knows your name. I rented a small, weathered cabin that was several hours away from any town, a place that boasted nothing but pine trees, a frozen lake, and the occasional deer. The pictures online had made it look picturesque, almost like something out of a painting, but I didn't mind the rustic look. I wanted authenticity. I drove most of the day, the tires crunching over gravel roads, passing no other cars for miles. The air got colder as I climbed higher into the mountains. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low on the horizon, streaking the sky with pale orange and purple. The cabin sat in a clearing, its wooden boards darkened with age, its windows reflecting the fading light. There was a small porch, a couple of rocking chairs, and a stone chimney that promised warmth inside. I parked my car and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and mildew, the kind of smell that sticks to everything if it isn't aired out regularly. The floor creaked under my boots, and the furniture was old but functional. A small kitchen sat on one side, complete with a stove, a fridge, and a sink. There were 2 bedrooms, one with a small twin bed and the other with a larger one that I assumed was the master. I dropped my bags, turned on the lights, and surveyed the place. Everything seemed normal, and I reminded myself that this isolation was exactly why I had come. I unpacked slowly, placing my things in drawers, arranging my food in the small kitchen cabinet. The quiet settled in, thick and heavy. It wasn't uncomfortable at first, more like a blanket around me. I made a fire in the fireplace, listening to the wood crackle and pop. Shadows danced along the walls, and I felt the tension of city life slowly drain from me. Dinner was simple, canned soup heated on the stove, but I ate it slowly, savoring the solitude. Night came quickly. The cabin had no cell service, and I didn't even try to check for signal. I wanted this trip to be separate from the rest of the world. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, occasionally rattling the cabin windows. The sounds were foreign and almost comforting at first, like reminders that I was alone in a real, living forest. I crawled into bed, warm under heavy blankets, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind and distant, echoing animal calls. The next morning, I woke early, the room still dim with pre-dawn light. I built another fire and brewed coffee over the stove. After breakfast, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The woods were dense, the trees tall and close together. There was a narrow path leading down toward the lake, which I followed cautiously. The ground was uneven, roots snaking across the dirt, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. Birds flitted through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a woodpecker drumming against a tree trunk. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was fully up. It was beautiful, a glassy expanse reflecting the sky and the surrounding forest. There was ice forming along the edges, even though it wasn't deep winter yet. I walked along the shoreline, skipping stones and letting my thoughts drift. It was the kind of peace I had imagined for months. But as I started back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud, fresh and deep. They weren't mine, and they were too large to be a deer or other animal. My heart rate picked up, but I reminded myself it was probably a hiker or someone staying nearby. I had seen no other signs of life, but maybe there was another cabin tucked away in the woods. When I returned, I locked the door behind me. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself the footprints could have been old, washed down by the morning dew. I spent the day reading, walking a little closer to the cabin, and chopping wood for the fire. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. No birds singing, no rustling animals, only the occasional distant wind through the branches. Shadows seemed darker, stretching longer than they should. I shrugged it off, blaming my imagination, and went to bed early. That night, the noises started. Not ordinary forest sounds, but something deliberate. a scraping against the side of the cabin, like someone moving cautiously over the wooden boards. I froze, listening. My first thought was a bear or a large animal, but the sound was too precise, too human. It circled the cabin slowly, step by step, scraping and shifting. I didn't dare open the door. I remembered the footprints from earlier and felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I stayed up the rest of the night, huddled under blankets, listening. The sounds didn't stop. Sometimes it would pause, almost as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening for me. I didn't sleep. I stared at the window, watching the shadows move in the faint moonlight, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed, and the dawn felt like it would never come. When morning arrived, I was exhausted. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, but there was no one there. The footprints were still fresh in some areas, disappearing into the forest. I debated leaving immediately, but I had driven hours to reach this place, and the thought of facing the forest alone was terrifying. I had to wait it out, try to understand what was happening. The next day, I left the cabin during daylight, hiking deeper into the woods to get a better look around. I carried a large stick for protection and stayed alert. That's when I saw the signs. Small traps set along the path, wires strung between trees, empty cans positioned to fall if disturbed. Someone had been here recently, watching. The realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't alone, and this wasn't some casual hiker. Someone had been tracking me, maybe even planning for this moment. I returned to the cabin cautiously, considering my options. I couldn't stay. I didn't have enough supplies for a long siege. The car was my only way out, but leaving meant walking past the areas where traps might be set. I decided to wait until nightfall, hoping I could slip out quietly. That night, I packed my essentials: a backpack with food, water, a flashlight, and a few other supplies. I kept the fire going to mask any sounds I might make when leaving. I waited until around midnight, listening for any movement outside. When there was nothing, I slipped out the door, hugging the shadows, staying low. The forest was a maze, and every step felt dangerous. I had to avoid the paths that were likely watched, moving through thick underbrush that scratched my arms and legs. The further I went, the more careful I became. I avoided open areas, sticking to shadows and tree lines. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement, but it was only branches swaying or deer fleeing at my approach. Hours passed, and I finally reached the gravel road where I had parked my car. My heart was still racing as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open. I didn't care if the engine made noise. I had to leave. The tires crunched over the gravel, and I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, the lights of civilization visible in the distance. I never went back to that cabin. I reported the traps and signs of intrusion to the local authorities, but they said there wasn't much they could do. Someone had been using the woods for hunting, maybe even to stalk people, and my presence had disrupted them. I didn't try to fight the fear that stayed with me for weeks afterward. The idea that someone had been so close, watching, planning, waiting, it lingered in my mind. Eventually, I started to feel safe again, but I never forgot the isolation, the quiet that was too quiet, the sense of being hunted. I learned something important. Nature can be beautiful and peaceful, but it can also hide danger in the most unexpected places. And when you are alone, even the smallest sign of intrusion becomes a threat you can't ignore. I still hike, still go into the woods, but I'm different now. I prepare more, I carry tools, I always tell someone where I'm going. I pay attention to footprints, broken branches, signs of life that don't belong. That cabin trip taught me that fear isn't always about what you imagine. It's about what's real and unseen, the human element that can turn a peaceful retreat into a nightmare, and that, more than anything else, changed the way I see the wilderness forever. I had been planning this trip for months. My work had been unbearable for weeks, and the stress was starting to feel like a physical weight pressing down on me. I needed to disappear for a while, to be completely alone in the woods, away from the constant buzzing of emails, phone calls, and the endless noise of the city. I found a small cabin online, tucked deep in a forest in a remote area. It was advertised as being off-grid with no neighbors for miles, just the cabin, a small stream nearby, and miles of forest. The pictures looked perfect. Rustic, wooden, with a fireplace, and a deck overlooking a clearing. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need for a week. Canned food, bottled water, a portable stove, blankets, clothes, a first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, and my camping gear just in case. I wanted to make sure I could survive here if anything went wrong. I left on a Thursday morning, taking a long drive away from the city. The further I drove, the quieter it became. The traffic thinned out, then disappeared entirely, replaced by the rhythmic sound of my tires on empty roads and the occasional crow or distant bark of a dog somewhere deep in the forest. By the time I turned off the last paved road onto a dirt trail, the sun was dipping low. The forest seemed older and denser than I had imagined. The trees were thick and tall, their branches forming a near-continuous canopy overhead. The air was cooler here, filled with the scent of wet earth and pine. I followed the directions from the cabin owner, winding through narrow paths, my car shaking over rocks and roots. I could feel my heartbeat speeding up, not from fear, but from excitement. I was about to be alone in the wilderness. The cabin appeared just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. It was smaller than it had looked in pictures, but still charming. The wooden exterior was weathered, but it had a solid look. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I wasn't sure if it was from the previous guests or just decoration. I parked and stepped out, letting the silence of the forest wash over me. There were no sounds of vehicles, no hum of electricity, nothing except the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant gurgle of the stream nearby. I spent the first hour unpacking and exploring the cabin. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood and something like old cooking oil. There was a kitchen with basic utensils, a small living area with a fireplace, and a single bedroom with a large, somewhat lumpy bed. I lit a few candles, since the cabin didn't have electricity, and sat on the porch watching the fading light. The woods were dark now, shadows thick and deep, and every sound, the cracking of branches, the rustle of leaves, made me hyper-aware. I reminded myself that I was safe, that this was just nature, nothing more. That first night was strangely unsettling. I had brought a few books to read, but I couldn't concentrate. Every small sound made me tense. A branch scraped against the cabin wall, and I jumped, only to realize it was the wind. My flashlight felt inadequate, too weak to pierce the darkness outside. I forced myself to sleep, wrapping myself tightly in blankets, but I woke several times hearing noises I couldn't identify. Faint thumps, a dragging sound that seemed far away but unmistakably deliberate. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the rational part of my brain wasn't very convincing. The next morning, I decided to explore the surroundings. I wanted to clear my head and get familiar with the terrain. The forest was dense and full of life. Birds called to one another, squirrels darted from tree to tree, and the air smelled of wet moss and fallen leaves. I followed the stream, which curved around the cabin's clearing. The water was cold and clear, and I could see fish darting beneath the surface. I walked for miles, noting the landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. It was peaceful, almost hypnotically so, but there was a constant tension at the back of my mind. Even in daylight, the forest felt like it had a presence, a sense that I was being watched, even if I knew I wasn't. On the third day, things started to feel off in a way I couldn't easily explain. I had gone into the cabin in the morning to make coffee when I noticed something strange on the porch. There were footprints, barefoot, small, human. They led from the edge of the forest directly to the cabin steps, and they were wet, like they had come through the stream. I froze. I had been alone here since I arrived. No one else was supposed to be nearby. I checked the windows and doors. They were all locked from the inside. The footprints ended at the porch and didn't continue anywhere else. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe some animal had left a mark that looked human. But over the next few hours, I started noticing more signs. A broken branch near the cabin, small scratches on the doorframe, and faint, distant noises at night, footsteps, twigs snapping, whispers of movement. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that people didn't just wander into a remote forest to follow strangers, but the thought kept gnawing at me. By the fourth night, the tension became unbearable. I hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time. I kept my knife on the bedside table and my flashlight at the ready. Every sound outside made my stomach tighten. The forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't noticed before, as if the shadows themselves were watching, shifting whenever I looked away. Around midnight, I heard it clearly. The sound of someone moving just outside the cabin. Soft steps in the leaves, deliberate and slow. My heart pounded and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin, stopping now and then, as if whoever it was searching, testing, waiting. I considered leaving, driving back in the middle of the night, but the dirt roads were treacherous in the dark. I had no cell signal and I didn't want to risk crashing in the forest. I stayed in the bedroom, knife in hand, straining to hear anything beyond the porch. Hours passed. Eventually, the noises stopped, but I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, I inspected the area around the cabin. I discovered something I hadn't expected. Small traps, almost like snares, set along the path leading up to the cabin. They were crude, but definitely intended to catch something or someone. My stomach sank. I realized that whoever had been outside the cabin wasn't just a casual wanderer. This was intentional. Someone had been watching, preparing, waiting. I spent the day barricading doors and windows as best I could, moving chairs against them, and piling heavy objects to create obstacles. I felt paranoid, but it was justified. Over the next 2 days, I stayed mostly inside, venturing only to refill water from the stream and grab food. I kept all lights off, trying to remain unnoticed, and I avoided the porch entirely. Every night, I heard movement, footsteps around the cabin, whispers in the wind, soft scratching on the walls. I couldn't identify how many people were outside, but the feeling of being hunted never left me. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, keeping my knife and flashlight close. On the 6th night, things escalated. I was awakened by a loud bang on the front door, followed by the sound of wood splintering. Someone had tried to break in. My heart felt like it would explode. I grabbed my knife, crept to the door, and listened. The banging continued, followed by heavy footsteps retreating into the woods. I realized how close I had come to a confrontation. I felt fear like I had never known before, raw, urgent, desperate. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to leave. The next morning, I packed everything into my car quickly, checking the surrounding woods constantly. I left no trace behind except for the items I couldn't carry. The forest felt different now, hostile, alive with unseen eyes. I drove down the dirt road, careful not to attract attention, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, a bird taking off, even my own heartbeat, made me jump. I didn't stop until I reached the paved road and finally saw the first car in miles. I felt relief wash over me, though it was mixed with lingering fear. I returned to the city that night, exhausted and shaken. The memories of the forest, the cabin, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me for weeks. I realized that sometimes the most terrifying experiences aren't supernatural, but human. Someone had been in those woods watching, following, and waiting. And while I had escaped, the thought that they were still out there, still capable of premeditated cruelty, haunted me. I never returned to the cabin, and I never went into the deep forest again. I kept the story to myself, not wanting anyone to dismiss it as paranoia or imagination. But I made a decision that has stayed with me. Never underestimate the quiet, the isolation, or the people who might be lurking where you least expect them. Safety is never guaranteed, and sometimes just being alone in the wrong place at the wrong time can change your life forever. That experience changed me. I learned to respect the wilderness. I had always loved the idea of being alone in the woods. The thought of escaping the constant noise of the city, leaving behind deadlines, people, and endless distractions, and just being completely isolated was intoxicating. I found a small cabin online, tucked away in the mountains, far from any road that cars frequently used. The photos made it look cozy, even a little rustic, with a wood stove, a small porch, and a little stream running nearby. It seemed perfect, exactly what I needed. A weekend to myself, to read, think, and just be. I left on Friday morning, driving with nothing but a backpack, some food, a first aid kit, and a couple of books. The roads became smaller as I left the city behind, then eventually turned into gravel and dirt paths that twisted up into the mountains. I passed no one, not even another car. The air changed gradually too. It grew cooler, fresher, with the smell of pine and wet earth filling the car. Birds occasionally darted across the road, and I even saw a deer grazing beside the trees. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows that made the forest seem deeper and darker than I had imagined. The cabin itself was exactly as pictured. A small wooden structure with a porch that looked out over a clearing. The windows were dusty, but the door opened easily. I had warned myself that it might be dusty or dirty, but it wasn't worse than I expected. I unpacked slowly, setting my things neatly on the small table inside. The cabin had a wood stove, which I checked carefully before stacking some logs beside it. I built a fire, watching the flames slowly eat the dry wood, casting dancing shadows against the walls. I ate a simple dinner I had packed: canned beans, bread, and a little cheese. The quiet outside was almost overwhelming, the way the forest seemed to swallow any sound I made. As night fell, I stepped onto the porch, trying to look at the stars. They were brighter than I had ever seen them, clear and numerous. The forest around me was black, only the edges of the clearing visible in the firelight. I felt a strange mixture of peace and unease. There was no one for miles, and yet the silence itself was heavy, almost suffocating. I stayed outside longer than I had planned, just listening. The occasional rustle in the trees, the distant crack of a branch, or the sharp cry of a bird somewhere deeper in the woods made my pulse quicken. I reminded myself that it was normal: deer, raccoons, maybe foxes, nothing more. I went to bed early, leaving the fire low so it could keep the cabin warm through the night. The bed was a simple mattress, firm but comfortable. I had slept in worse places, and the cabin smelled faintly of pine and old wood, which was oddly comforting. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that made my stomach drop. Something heavy, deliberate, moving near the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought it might be a bear. We did have bears in the area, and the rustling sounded like something large pushing through the brush. My heart pounded as I considered the possibilities. I had a small hunting knife in my backpack, and I clutched it instinctively. The sound stopped after a few seconds. Then there was another sound, a faint scraping, like nails on wood, coming from the side of the cabin. My mind raced. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, though I know it was probably only a few minutes. I told myself that humans didn't usually wander around isolated cabins at night, and yet the idea that someone could be out there just watching was terrifying. I debated whether to get up and check, but reason and fear clashed. Finally, I decided to stay still and quiet. I didn't hear any more noises for the rest of the night, but I barely slept. Morning came slowly. The light filtered through the dusty windows in thin, pale beams. I forced myself to get up and make breakfast, though I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing appeared. I decided I needed to check around the cabin, so I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The ground around the cabin was trampled in places, not recently, but enough to show that someone had walked here before. I frowned, remembering that I had been told the cabin was rarely used, yet the evidence suggested otherwise. Small marks in the dirt, a bit of litter tucked under a log, nothing major, but enough to make me uneasy. I tried to push the thoughts away. I told myself it was probably just hunters or hikers who had passed by earlier in the week. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area. The woods were dense, but I found a small path along the stream. The water was clear, running over rocks and roots. I stopped to drink and rest. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and the rustling of small animals. It should have been peaceful, but every shadow made me jump. Every snap of a branch reminded me of the sounds I had heard the night before. The second night was worse. I had tried to calm myself, but as darkness fell, I noticed the subtle differences from the night before. The wind carried strange noises, distant, low, and deliberate. Twigs snapped closer to the cabin than before. I kept the fire going all night this time, letting it burn higher than necessary. I stayed awake longer, listening and watching the darkness around the clearing. At some point, I saw a figure, or I thought I did, slipping between the trees. I froze, heart racing, but when I blinked, it was gone. It had been too quick, too human to be an animal. By the third day, I realized I was terrified. I had come for solitude, and I had found it, but not in the way I had imagined. The isolation made me hyper-aware, paranoid. I kept my backpack ready, knife and small axe within reach. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could, moving logs to block windows, placing rocks around the perimeter, anything that gave me a sense of control. I didn't want to leave the cabin, yet I knew staying alone in the woods for too long could be dangerous. On the third night, I couldn't sleep at all. I could hear someone moving outside again, closer this time. The sound of boots on dirt, slow and deliberate. I realized they weren't just passing, they were circling the cabin. My mind raced. I knew there was no way to call for help. There was no cell signal, no one for miles, and the nearest road was a long hike away. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight and waited, trying to calm my breathing. Every instinct told me to stay silent, to not give away my position, yet part of me wanted to confront whoever or whatever it was. Then I heard a voice, low and distant, calling my name. My stomach dropped. I didn't recognize it, and I didn't respond. Whoever it was, they weren't from around here. I huddled near the door, listening as the voice faded, replaced by silence. Then came the slow scrape of something trying to push the door open. My knife in hand, I braced myself. It stopped. The footsteps moved to the other side of the cabin, then back again. It was a pattern now, slow, deliberate, and terrifying. I realized with horror that this wasn't an accident or a lost hiker. Someone was testing me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stayed awake until dawn. The night was a blur of fear and panic. When light finally came, I gathered my things quickly. I couldn't take the risk of staying another night. As I packed, I tried to make sense of the previous days. The person or people hadn't made any attempt to enter forcefully, just enough to scare, to assert that they were there. I had been lucky, and I knew it. I left as quickly as I could, walking down the dirt path to the nearest road. Every step made me tense. Every sound of rustling in the trees made me flinch. Finally, I reached the road, where a few cars passed by. I got in the first car that stopped, and I drove straight to the nearest town, shaken and drained. I didn't look back, even when I thought I saw someone standing on the edge of the trees, watching me leave. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I learned later that the area had a few illegal squatters, people who lived in the woods and sometimes followed hikers or visitors. I realized I had stumbled into someone else's territory, and my presence had been seen as a threat, or perhaps just entertainment for them. The fear I felt was real, grounded, and horrifying because it wasn't supernatural, it was human. I never went back to that cabin. I still love the woods, the isolation, and the beauty of being alone in nature, but I now understand the danger of assuming solitude means safety. The experience taught me respect for the wilderness, for the unknown, and for the people who might share it with you, willingly or not. I bought a small handheld GPS, a stronger knife, and I make sure I tell someone where I'm going now. The mountains are still beautiful, but they are also unpredictable, and I learned that lesson the hardest way. Even now, months later, I sometimes drive past the mountains on my way to another hiking trip, and I feel a chill thinking about that cabin. The fire, the shadows, the deliberate sounds of footsteps outside my door. I can still remember. I had been planning this trip for months. After months of city life, constant work stress, and never-ending noise, I wanted nothing more than to disappear for a week, alone, in the woods. I found a small cabin listed online that seemed perfect. It wasn't advertised as a vacation rental or a resort cabin, just a private property tucked deep into a forest in northern Vermont. The photos showed a wooden cabin with a tin roof, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, and a small pond nearby. It was isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long, winding through narrow roads surrounded by thick trees. I passed only a handful of cars in the 3 hours it took to get there. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping behind the trees, turning the forest into a mix of shadows and dim orange light. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, though smaller in person. A single dirt driveway led up to it, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the porch. The wood creaked under my feet, and I noticed cobwebs in the corners near the door. I thought nothing of it. After all, the place had probably been empty for some time. Inside, the cabin was rustic but functional. A small kitchen area had a wood stove, a few cabinets, and an old fridge. The living area had a couch, a small table, and a wood-burning fireplace. A narrow staircase led to a loft where the bedroom was. Everything looked clean, though worn. The smell of old wood and something faintly musty hung in the air. I set my bags down, unpacked my essentials, and decided to explore the area outside before it got fully dark. The pond behind the cabin was small, half hidden by tall reeds and bushes. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky. I noticed some footprints in the soft dirt near the water's edge. They were small, like someone had been walking barefoot, but there were no other signs of human activity. Birds called softly from the trees, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. The forest seemed alive, but in a quiet, almost eerie way. As night fell, I lit the fireplace and cooked some dinner on the stove. Outside, the woods grew darker, and the sounds of nocturnal animals became more prominent. I could hear twigs snapping under small feet, raccoons, maybe deer, but occasionally, a sound made me pause, like the crunch of a larger footstep, heavier than any animal I knew lived in the area. I chalked it up to my imagination. I slept fitfully that first night. The wind shook the windows, and I kept hearing noises outside, small scratches at the door, the occasional thump on the roof. I told myself it was animals, maybe squirrels or raccoons, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke to find the footprints from the night before gone. That made me uneasy. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that the cabin was in a forest, and the ground was soft. Tracks could disappear quickly. I spent the day chopping wood, exploring the forest a little further, and taking photographs of the scenery. There was a certain beauty in the isolation, a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. That night, around midnight, I woke to a noise that made my heart skip. It was coming from outside, near the cabin. At first, it sounded like someone walking around in the leaves, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. Then there was a scraping sound at the side of the cabin, near the kitchen window. I didn't move, just held my breath, telling myself it was a branch or a raccoon. But then I heard the faintest thump on the door handle, like someone testing it. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully looked out the window. Nothing. The yard was empty, the trees swaying in the wind. I checked the door, double-locked it, and went back to bed, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I found more signs that someone, or something, had been near the cabin. My firewood had been disturbed. A few logs were moved from their pile, and there were new footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They were larger than mine, human-sized, but I could only see them clearly in the soft mud near the porch. Whoever it was, they hadn't entered the cabin, at least not yet. Panic started creeping in. I spent the next day on edge. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I felt watched constantly. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. I made sure all doors and windows were locked, and I even used the firewood pile to barricade the front door slightly. That night, I kept the lights on, though the glow only cast more shadows. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone, or something, scraping against the side of the cabin again. This time, it wasn't soft. It was deliberate, harsh, almost methodical. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. My heart raced. I shined the flashlight toward the sound. I could just barely make out a figure moving near the trees, tall and human-shaped. My hands shook as I held the light on it, but it vanished behind the trees almost immediately. I stayed awake until sunrise, clutching a fireplace poker, listening to every sound. When the sun finally came up, I went outside cautiously. The footprints were back, circling the cabin. This time, there were prints leading away from the cabin into the deeper woods, then returning again, always circling. Whoever it was had been watching me for hours. I realized I had no choice but to leave. I packed quickly, throwing essentials into my bag. As I opened the front door, I froze. The footprints weren't just circling. They were inside the dirt near the porch now, right up to the door. And then I saw it. On the ground, near the cabin's corner, there was a small, crude pile of stones arranged in a circle. Someone had left it there deliberately, like a marker or a warning. My stomach sank. I ran to my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour later, sweating and shaking. I didn't tell anyone exactly what happened, just that the cabin felt wrong, like someone had been waiting for me there. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see those footprints circling the cabin, see the pile of stones. I realized how dangerous it had been to stay there. It wasn't haunted, and it wasn't supernatural, but the thought that someone had been watching me, studying my movements, planning, waiting, that was worse than any ghost. Eventually, I decided to report the cabin to local authorities, not knowing what I would say. When I described the property, they told me it had been abandoned for years, but locals occasionally saw people in the forest, living off-grid, sometimes leaving signs of their presence. They called it squatters, but that didn't make me feel any safer. Whoever had been at that cabin wasn't just a squatter. They had watched me, and I had no idea how long they had been there before I arrived. I haven't gone back to that area since. I don't hike alone anymore, and I don't stay in isolated cabins without checking in advance with someone I trust. That cabin was beautiful, peaceful even, but the moment I arrived, it became a trap. The lesson I learned was simple and terrifying. Isolation can hide danger in ways you can't predict, and sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost. It's a person, unseen, patient, and waiting. Even now, years later, whenever I drive through a forest, I notice every shadow a little more carefully, every sound a little more closely. The memory of that cabin, the footprints, the circle of stones, the feeling of being watched, stays with me. And I know if I had stayed one more night, I might not have walked away at all. It started as a simple plan. A weekend alone at a cabin to escape the noise of the city, to breathe in the silence of the woods, and maybe write a little. I had found the cabin online through one of those rental sites. It was tucked deep into a forest I had never visited before, a place that looked untouched, the kind of seclusion that promised peace. The photos were convincing, rustic but functional. A small porch overlooking a clearing, a wood-burning stove, shelves lined with a few books, and a stack of firewood near the door. I was tired, restless, and willing to pay extra for isolation. I packed my bags with the essentials. Food that didn't require refrigeration, water, a first aid kit, notebooks, pens, and a flashlight. I didn't bother with a phone charger. I wanted no distractions. The drive was long. As the asphalt ended, gravel turned into dirt, and the dirt became a narrow path overgrown with shrubs on both sides. There was no signal for miles. The cabin finally appeared, small and unassuming, partly hidden behind a wall of pines. It was everything the pictures promised. I parked and stepped out, the smell of pine needles and wet earth filling the air. A light rain had fallen earlier, leaving the ground soft and damp. I took a deep breath, the weight of city life lifting slightly, and dragged my bags up the uneven path to the porch. Inside, it was colder than I expected. The windows were thick with dust and water streaks, letting in a dim, gray light. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sour, like mildew. I flicked the switch for the overhead light. It worked, but flickered once before staying on. The cabin was tiny, a small living area with a worn sofa, a table, the wood stove in one corner. Beyond that, a narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. I dropped my bags on the floor, sat on the sofa for a moment, and just listened. No birds, no wind rustling through trees, just the quiet drip of rain from the eaves. It was calming and unnerving at the same time. I decided to unpack slowly. The rain started again, light at first, then heavier, hammering the roof. I started a fire in the stove, chopping the wood I had brought from the stack. The flames crackled and threw shadows against the walls. I wrote for a while, but my concentration faltered. I found myself staring out the window at the woods, at the darkness behind the thinning mist. The forest felt different here, thick, dense, almost suffocating. There were gaps where I could see nothing but black trunks lined against the gray sky, and at the edges, shadows seemed to move in ways that didn't make sense. By evening, the storm outside had grown stronger. The wind rattled the windows, and the rain pounded like nails against the roof. I had dinner, simple pasta, and cleaned up quickly. As I moved around the cabin, I noticed little things that didn't make sense. One of the chairs in the corner seemed slightly out of place, though I was sure I hadn't touched it. The kitchen knife block had a knife missing, though I always counted them. The front door, which I had closed firmly, seemed slightly ajar, but I had locked it. I brushed it off as fatigue and the storm's effect. The first night was restless. I had trouble sleeping. Every sound from outside made me tense. Twigs snapping under heavy branches, the wind hammering against the siding, the occasional thump of something rolling in the mud outside. At some point, I thought I heard someone walking just beyond the clearing, near the edge of the woods. I froze, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and eventually drifted off. The next day was cloudy and damp. I explored the immediate area around the cabin. There was a small creek, shallow but fast-moving, cutting through the forest a few hundred feet from the porch. I followed it briefly, finding tracks in the mud. Deer, maybe a fox, and something else, larger with a long stride. It looked human, but it was too deep to be sure. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming someone had been hiking recently. I returned to the cabin, but the sense of unease lingered. By nightfall, things had escalated. The wind had picked up even more, and the rain had turned into a downpour. I lit the fire early and sat close, the flickering flames my only comfort. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was a branch, but the pattern was deliberate. Tap, pause, tap, tap. My stomach tightened. I didn't move for several minutes, staring at the window. The storm was loud enough that I couldn't tell if the tapping continued or if I was imagining it. I finally forced myself to check. Outside, nothing. No movement, no figure, just rain streaming down the glass. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Sleep didn't come easily again. I lay awake, listening, imagining movement just outside the cabin. The taps returned in the night, softer this time, closer to the bedroom window. I couldn't see through the heavy rain, but I felt them, a deliberate pressure that made the hairs on my arms stand. At one point, I swear I saw a shadow move across the room, fleeting, impossible to place. Morning brought relief, but a tension remained, a sense that I was not entirely alone. The third day, I decided to leave the cabin for a short hike, to distract myself and to stretch my legs. The forest was thick, branches slick with rain, the ground muddy and uneven. I followed a narrow trail that ran parallel to the creek. About an hour in, I noticed more tracks, fresh, large, human. Someone had been near the cabin very recently. My pulse quickened. The trail led me to a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. Here, the ground was trampled, the mud churned up, and I saw marks where something heavy had been dragged. My stomach turned. It looked deliberate, recent, and close to the cabin. I hurried back, adrenaline pumping. The cabin seemed smaller, oppressive even. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and avoided looking outside. The storm had passed, leaving a heavy mist hanging low over the forest. I spent the afternoon inside, moving slowly, checking every corner. Every small sound made me jump. The solitude I had sought now felt like a trap. That evening, around dusk, I heard it again. This time it wasn't a tap. It was a crunching of leaves, deliberate, slow, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart raced. I grabbed a kitchen knife for comfort and tried to calm myself. The sound circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped. Silence, thick and heavy. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, listening, imagining eyes in the darkness. I didn't sleep at all. The fourth day, I realized I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night, not knowing if someone, or something, was watching me. I packed quickly, moving in bursts of anxious energy. Before leaving, I went to check the porch. That's when I saw it. Deep scratches on the wood, vertical, claw-like, not from an animal. They were fresh, glistening from the rain. Panic overtook me. I grabbed my bags, ran to the car, and drove as fast as the dirt road allowed, the engine roaring in protest. I didn't stop until I reached a paved road, where cell signal returned, and I could finally call someone if I needed. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the forest, the tracks, the scratches. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales, it was real, human. The isolation, the remoteness of the cabin, and the dense forest had allowed someone to hide close by, someone patient, someone aware of every move I made. I reported it to the rental company, who were alarmed, and to the local authorities. The area was searched, but nothing was found. No footprints beyond mine, no sign of whoever had been there. I never went back, and I never planned to. The experience changed me. I realized how vulnerable I could be, how quickly solitude could become a trap. I learned to respect isolation, to never underestimate the danger of remoteness, and to always trust my instincts. What stayed with me the most wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that someone had been there, watching, close enough to reach out if they wanted to, and I had walked away alone. The memory of that cabin, the silence, and the darkness of the forest haunted me for months. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not supernatural, not imagined, but real, hidden in plain sight. Even months later, I replay every detail in my mind. The smell of wet pine, the sound of the wind and rain, the taps at the window, the marks on the porch. I've told the story a few times, and each time I do, I feel the same tightening in my chest. But I also feel grateful. Grateful that I left when I did, that I didn't try to confront what was out there. That weekend could have ended very differently. The forest, the cabin, the quiet, they were beautiful and terrifying in the same breath. I still drive past forests, still see cabins, but I never consider staying alone again. That was a lesson learned the I never really liked being alone in the woods, but sometimes life corners you into things you wouldn't normally do. Back in late October, after a long stretch of sleepless weeks in the city, I needed a break. My head was pounding from work stress, and I felt like I hadn't breathed clean air in months. My friend Martin, who often rented small cabins for hunting trips, told me about a place near Stillwater Lake, a secluded cabin deep in the forest, about an hour from the nearest paved road. He said it was quiet, clean, and perfect for unwinding. I booked it for 4 days, planning to take my camera and spend some time hiking, maybe catch the last bits of autumn before winter hit. The drive up there was longer than I expected. The paved roads ended halfway, and what followed was a stretch of gravel that seemed endless. My car wasn't made for that kind of terrain. Every rock under the tires sounded like it could split something underneath. The forest was thick on both sides, mostly pines mixed with some oaks still clinging to orange leaves. I kept checking my phone, but the signal had dropped to 0 bars long before I reached the cabin. When I finally saw it, The sun was already sliding down behind the trees. The cabin looked smaller than it did in the listing photos. Just one floor, a single front window, a narrow porch with a wooden chair, and a tin chimney poking through the roof. There was an old metal water pump beside the porch and a small fire pit a few yards away. A trail led down toward the lake, which I could barely see through the trees. Everything was silent except for the faint rustle of dry leaves and a woodpecker tapping somewhere far off. Inside, the cabin was simple. One bed, a small table, a wood stove, and some shelves with old canned food and dusty tools. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and rust. There was no electricity, no running water. The toilet was an outhouse behind the trees, and the only light came from a few oil lamps and the stove. It wasn't cozy exactly, but it felt peaceful enough for what I needed. Isolation, quiet, and a few nights away from everything. The first night went by fine. I cooked a can of beans on the stove, ate in silence, and read from a book I had brought. I heard a few noises outside, twigs snapping, the soft hoot of an owl, wind brushing the branches. I told myself it was just animals moving around. Around midnight, I blew out the lamp and tried to sleep. The darkness was thicker than anything I was used to. Even with my eyes open, I couldn't see my own hand. I could only hear the wind and my own breathing. The second day, I explored a bit. The trail to the lake was narrow and uneven, lined with fallen leaves that hid rocks and roots underneath. The lake itself was beautiful, still, flat, and gray under a cloudy sky. I could see my reflection perfectly. Across the water, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. I walked along the edge, noticing a few old footprints near the mud. They didn't look fresh, maybe a week or two old, hard to tell. Near the lake, there was a broken wooden dock, half sunk into the water. I sat there for a while, just watching the still surface. The silence was strange. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, almost pressing against me. There were no birds, no fish breaking the water, nothing. I decided to head back before it got too late. That night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but enough to snap me awake. Something like footsteps outside the cabin, slow and careful. My heart started pounding. I stayed still, listening. The steps stopped. Then I heard what sounded like a boot scraping against wood. Came from the porch. I reached for my flashlight, but it took me a few seconds to find it. When I finally switched it on, I aimed it at the window. Nothing. Just the empty porch and trees swaying slightly in the dark. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a deer or even a raccoon climbing the steps. But there was something about the rhythm of those steps that didn't sound like an animal. They were heavy, slow, deliberate. I stayed awake for another hour, flashlight in hand, but nothing else happened. When morning came, I went outside to check. The ground was covered in leaves, so it was hard to see tracks clearly. Still, near the porch, I found one clear mark, a partial boot print, pressed into the soft dirt. It wasn't mine. Mine had a wavy tread pattern, and this one was more squared off like work boots. I felt uneasy, but tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone else used this area, a hunter, a fisherman. It wasn't impossible. I spent the day close to the cabin, collecting wood for the stove and trying to distract myself. Around late afternoon, I walked down to the lake again, just to shake off the tension. But something was different that time. Near the dock, I noticed a small pile of wet footprints, bare feet, not boots, leading from the edge of the water toward the trees. The prints were fresh, still glistening. My stomach turned cold. I looked around but saw no one. The air was dead still, and even the sound of the water seemed distant. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the wet marks, trying to make sense of them. Eventually, I walked back to the cabin, feeling watched the entire way. That night was worse. Around 10 p.m., I locked the door, placed the flashlight beside the bed, and tried to ignore every creak and rustle outside. The wind had picked up, and the branches scratched lightly against the roof. I must have dozed off at some point, but I woke again to a different kind of sound, something metallic tapping lightly against the window frame. I froze. It was slow, uneven, like someone dragging something small across the glass. I didn't move for a while. Then the tapping stopped, replaced by faint footsteps again. They circled the cabin this time, around the back, across the porch, then to the side where the outhouse was. My mouth was dry, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I wanted to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. I waited until the sounds faded. When I finally got up and shined the light through the window, everything looked the same as before, just darkness and trees. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. The stove popping, the roof creaking, even the crackle of cooling metal. When morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I walked around the cabin again, more carefully this time. Behind the cabin, near the trees, I found something that made me stop. A piece of rope hanging from a low branch. It looked cut, frayed at the end. Beneath it was a patch of disturbed soil, like someone had dug there recently. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking. It looked like someone had been doing something out there. Maybe setting traps, or maybe something worse. I went back inside and packed most of my things. My plan was to leave that afternoon, but when I went to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the fuel gauge, it was fine. The battery was working. The lights came on. But when I turned the key, there was just a grinding noise. I tried again, nothing. I opened the hood, looked inside, but I wasn't a mechanic. Everything looked normal to me, but the engine refused to start. That's when I noticed something else. The gas cap was off. It was lying on the ground beside the car. Someone had unscrewed it. I felt my knees weaken a little. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but it couldn't be good. I spent the next few hours pacing around the cabin, trying to decide what to do. There was no phone signal, and the nearest town was easily 15 miles away. Walking that far through forest roads with night coming didn't seem smart. As it got darker, I gathered all the lamps I had, filled them with oil, and set them around the cabin. I kept the flashlight in my pocket and a knife from the kitchen on the table. I couldn't eat. I just sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The forest outside was quiet again. That strange, heavy kind of quiet that almost feels alive. Around midnight, it started again. Footsteps, closer this time. They came straight up to the porch, stopped by the door. Then something scraped slowly across the wood, like a metal tool. I sat there, barely breathing. The handle of the door moved, just slightly, like someone testing it. I had locked it tight, but still, my chest felt like it was going to burst. I waited, eyes fixed on the shadow under the door. The footsteps moved again, this time toward the side window. I saw a faint shadow pass across it. I didn't move, didn't blink. Stayed there for a while. Then it was gone. I waited another hour before I dared to move. When the first light of dawn came through the trees, I stepped outside. I didn't go far, just enough to see what had happened. The ground on the porch had several new prints, boots, large ones. Fresh mud still clung to them. Near the window, there were handprints, smeared across the glass. They were streaked with something that looked like dirt, or maybe something darker. That was it for me. I packed everything, took my backpack, and started walking. I didn't care about the car anymore. I just needed to get out. The road stretched endlessly, winding through trees and hills. Every sound made me turn around. I had been planning this trip for months. After weeks of back-to-back work and constant noise in the city, I needed silence, space, and the kind of isolation that only the deep woods could provide. I rented a small cabin tucked far away from the main roads, accessible only by a narrow, gravel path that twisted through dense trees. The pictures online had shown a rustic, welcoming place, with a wood-burning stove, a small porch, and a lake in the distance. I told myself I wanted peace, but I was also craving adventure. The kind that could be overwhelming in its intensity, the kind that would make you feel alive simply because you were alone and vulnerable in the middle of nowhere. I drove for hours through winding roads, passing abandoned farms and stretches of forest that seemed endless. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the road. The cabin itself was smaller than I had imagined, almost box-like. with wooden panels that had weathered to a dark, rough brown. Its windows reflected the fading sunlight, and the silence around it was immediate and almost suffocating. No birds sang here, no distant dogs barked. Even the wind felt muffled. I pulled my bags out of the car and walked up the narrow steps to the porch. Everything creaked under my weight, the wood under my feet, the door as I opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint, lingering scent of damp earth. The floorboards groaned as I moved across them. I unpacked quickly, eager to explore before darkness settled completely. The cabin was modest inside. A small living area with a couch and a table, a tiny kitchen, and a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. There was a stack of firewood next to the stove, and I made a mental note to get it burning soon. I spent the next hour wandering around the surrounding area. The cabin was on a slight rise, and from the porch, I could see a field that gave way to thick forest, with a small lake glinting in the fading light. Birds began to stir in the distant trees, their calls faint and irregular. The forest seemed peaceful at first, almost inviting, but as I stood there listening, I realized something was off. There were no trails or clear paths, only dense trees that seemed to go on forever. Every now and then, I thought I heard snapping branches, but the wind was calm. I shook off the feeling as paranoia, fueled by my own imagination and the stories I had read about people getting lost in the woods. Night fell faster than I expected. I went back inside, lit the fire, and prepared a simple dinner. The cabin glowed warmly against the growing darkness outside. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet and the warmth, feeling that fragile sense of contentment that comes with being completely alone yet safe. After dinner, I cleaned up, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. Around midnight, I went to bed, exhausted from the drive and the day's exploration. The bed was narrow and creaked when I shifted my weight. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the quiet and the rocking of the cabin settling. But sleep was uneasy. Every time I started to drift off, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I thought it was just the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls or the occasional snap of a branch hitting the roof. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal for a cabin in the woods to make noises at night. Around 3 a.m., I woke suddenly. Something felt wrong. My body was tense, my heart racing. The wind was still, the cabin silent except for the faint creak of the floorboards as they expanded and contracted. But I could hear something else, a soft, irregular sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon maybe, scratching in the underbrush. But the noise didn't sound right. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Footsteps, uneven but purposeful, moving closer to the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever it was had noticed me awake. I stayed perfectly still for several minutes, heart hammering, listening to the silence that followed. Then I heard it again, this time a scrape against the side of the cabin. I felt a chill crawl over me. I didn't move, didn't breathe, barely dared to think. Whoever was out there clearly knew the cabin was occupied. I debated what to do. There was no cell service here. I could yell, but my voice would carry through the forest and only draw attention. The thought of stepping outside was terrifying. The only option I felt I had was to arm myself as best as I could. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a heavy cast iron pan. I stuffed a towel in my pocket and held the pan tightly, making my way to the window. Peering through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness, trees swaying gently in the moonlight, shadows stretching across the ground. The footprints were gone. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, a branch falling or an animal brushing against the cabin. But then I noticed them, footprints in the mud leading directly to the porch. Big ones, human. The realization hit me hard. Someone had come here, walked right up to the cabin, and might still be out there. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Burglary, vandalism, worse. I had no weapon except the pan, no escape route except through the forest, and no way to call for help. The fear was sharp and tangible, gripping me in a way I hadn't felt before. I decided to wait. I stayed by the window, eyes wide, listening. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance. I didn't dare move until first light. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously. The footprints led from the edge of the forest to the porch, then back into the trees. They were large, but I couldn't tell anything else. No prints of gloves or shoes that would give away a brand or style. I inspected the cabin carefully. Nothing was broken, nothing taken, but the sense of intrusion remained. The woods around me, which had seemed serene and inviting the day before, now felt hostile and oppressive. I spent the next day on edge. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, made me tense. I explored cautiously, sticking to areas I could see clearly from the cabin. I marked my boundaries in my mind: the porch, the small field, the path to the lake. Beyond that, I would not go. As night approached, I fortified the cabin as best as I could. I pushed the furniture against the doors, set the fire to keep warm, and sat with a baseball bat I found in the corner. I barely slept that night, dozing only in brief intervals, waking at every sound. The next morning, I considered leaving, but the cabin was so far from the road that even getting back to my car would mean hours in the forest, retracing the path I had driven in. I felt trapped, isolated. I spent the day gathering information, checking the area for signs of the intruder, making sure I had a clear path to escape if needed. I found more footprints, some leading away from the cabin in different directions, others circling near the lake. Whoever had come here before had been thorough, familiar with moving quietly and leaving minimal traces. The idea of someone watching the cabin, moving unseen among the trees, made my stomach turn. Over the next several days, I stayed vigilant. I never saw anyone again, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I left the cabin to gather firewood or check the perimeter, I moved quickly, scanning constantly, heart racing. I learned to notice small details: the sound of wind through the trees, the difference between animal tracks and human ones, subtle signs that someone had been here. I set small traps, simple arrangements of sticks that would snap if walked on, just to know if someone approached while I slept. The psychological toll was heavy. I felt exhausted, anxious, constantly tense. I stopped exploring and stayed near the cabin, unable to shake the memory of those footsteps. Nights were the worst. The isolation, the darkness, the constant waiting made it feel like every shadow was alive. I began keeping a journal, trying to distract myself, to organize my thoughts. I wrote down every sound, every movement I saw, every small detail of the cabin and surrounding forest. The act of recording helped me feel some control over the situation, even if only slightly. After nearly a week, I finally heard a vehicle on the gravel road. I rushed to the porch and saw another hiker, a man driving a small SUV, making his way up the path. Relief washed over me. I ran to meet him, waving, shouting, finally able to speak. He didn't notice the panic etched across my face. I told him briefly about the cabin, about the footprints, about my fear. He listened, nodded, and suggested I pack up and leave. His presence alone, another human nearby, made the woods feel less threatening, less oppressive. I followed his advice. Packing up, I double-checked the cabin, leaving everything exactly as I had found it. I didn't want to linger. I loaded my bags into my car. I had been planning this trip for months. After a year filled with deadlines, work stress, and the constant noise of the city, I needed a break. I wanted complete isolation, somewhere I could disappear for a week, with nothing but trees, cold air, and silence. That's how I ended up at a cabin deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, and far away from any cell phone signal. The owner had promised a truly off-the-grid experience, and they weren't lying. I arrived late in the afternoon, driving down a narrow, winding dirt road that felt more like a trail. The GPS had stopped working about 10 minutes before I reached the place, and by the time I got there, the sun was low and the shadows from the trees stretched long and thin across the ground. The cabin itself was small, made of dark, weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a front porch that creaked when I stepped on it. It looked sturdy, but old, like it had survived decades of storms and cold winters. There were no neighbors nearby, and the nearest building I could see was at least half a mile away through the dense forest. Inside, it smelled of dust, old wood, and faint mildew. There were basic amenities: a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a single bathroom with a shower, and a loft with a thin mattress that would be my bed. Everything was simple but clean. I unpacked my bag, set my flashlight and supplies on the counter, and went outside to take in the last of the daylight. The air was crisp, and the forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural at first. There were no cars, no voices, no animals that I could see, just the occasional rustle of leaves. The silence itself felt heavy. As darkness fell, I lit the stove and started making dinner. I had brought canned food, some bread, and a small bag of instant coffee. Eating alone felt strangely peaceful at first. I sat by the small window, looking out into the forest, and felt like I could finally breathe. But as the night deepened, I realized how completely alone I was. The trees outside looked black against the night sky, and the wind made them sway in ways that cast long, moving shadows over the cabin walls. I told myself it was just the wind, that the noises I kept hearing were the forest moving. Still, there was a constant feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew logically I wasn't. After dinner, I decided to explore the cabin. There was a small cellar door in the kitchen, hidden under the stairs. It was old and slightly warped, with a rusty latch. I opened it and peered inside. The cellar was narrow, filled with shelves that had old jars, cans, and tools covered in dust. Nothing unusual, but the air smelled colder down there, damp and heavy. I made a mental note to be careful with the stairs. They creaked dangerously under any weight. I returned to the loft to sleep, but the bed was thin, and the floorboards groaned with every movement. I tossed and turned, hearing every little sound outside: the wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, and something heavier that sounded like footsteps on the dirt outside. I tried to tell myself it was an animal or even my imagination. I had expected some wildlife noises, but there was a difference between a deer rustling and the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the underbrush. I lay in the dark, gripping my flashlight, listening, trying to stay awake. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. Morning brought little comfort. I woke to sunlight filtering through the thin curtains, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. I felt restless, uneasy. Something had been off during the night, though I couldn't place it exactly. I tried to shake it off as cabin fever, the product of being alone in a strange place. I made breakfast, boiled water for coffee, and decided to go for a walk in the forest. I had brought a map, a compass, and a backpack with essentials, but as I walked, I realized I had no real sense of direction. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense, and every path I tried to take seemed to twist back on itself. The more I walked, the more I felt the cabin disappear behind me, swallowed by the forest. By midday, I had circled back to the cabin, sweaty and frustrated. That's when I first noticed the footprints near the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, human, and large, leading from the woods toward the cabin. My heart started racing, but I told myself it had to be a hiker or a local hunter. The problem was, there were no other cabins around for miles, and the area wasn't exactly a known trail. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. I stayed near the cabin the rest of the day, making sure to lock the doors and windows, even though there was no lock other than a simple latch. That night, the noises were worse. Footsteps, branches snapping, and a low thud that came from the cabin side where the cellar door was. I sat in the loft, flashlight in hand, trying to convince myself it was an animal. But animals don't open latches or move with such intent. I didn't sleep much that night, keeping the flashlight close, listening, and waiting. The following day, I explored the perimeter of the cabin more carefully. I found more footprints leading up to the side and back doors. They were uneven, as if the person had been moving slowly, deliberately, and sometimes stopping, as if watching something. The realization hit me slowly, terrifyingly. Someone had been around my cabin, possibly watching me, possibly waiting. My first instinct was to call for help, but there was no signal. I considered driving back to the main road, but the dirt trail was long, winding, and I wasn't confident I could make it in daylight alone without being seen. I started thinking about defense. I found an old hunting rifle in the corner of the cellar. It was dusty, but it seemed to work. I cleaned it as best I could and kept it with me constantly. I barricaded the doors with chairs and anything heavy I could find, even though it didn't feel like a solid solution. Every sound outside made my stomach tighten. Footsteps, rustling, branches snapping, sometimes far away, sometimes close. I realized I had no idea how long the person had been watching, or if they were still around. I tried to keep busy during the day, chopping firewood, cleaning the cabin, checking the food supplies. But the forest felt alive, aware. Every time I looked out a window, I saw a branch move, a shadow that lingered too long, the occasional glimpse of a figure darting behind the trees. My mind raced, trying to rationalize everything. I had read stories of campers being watched or stalked, but I had never imagined it would feel this real. By the third night, I had only slept for a few hours, broken by fear and anxiety. I decided I needed to leave at dawn. Staying another night was not an option. I spent the night packing my essentials, making sure the rifle was loaded, and preparing for a long walk back to the main road. I couldn't wait for someone to show up. I needed to get out myself. When the first light of dawn came, I opened the door carefully, rifle in hand. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it had been holding its breath all night. I walked briskly, following the trail I had driven in on, listening for any sound behind me. Every few minutes, I would glance over my shoulder, imagining someone following me. The footprints I had seen before were gone, but I didn't trust that meant anything. Hours passed. The trail twisted and turned, and I was exhausted, my legs and shoulders aching from the pack and the stress. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the main dirt road in the distance. My heart lifted and I ran the final stretch. A car passed by and I waved it down, explaining in broken, urgent sentences that I had been alone in a cabin, possibly stalked. The driver called the local authorities. When they arrived at the cabin later that day, they found evidence of someone having been there recently. Footprints in the dirt, marks on the doors, a half-buried hole behind the cabin where someone had clearly tried to dig or hide something. The authorities said it was likely a local who had been watching the cabin for days, waiting for someone to come, but they had never been able to catch him in the act. I never found out who it was or why they were there, but the thought of it still haunts me. I don't think I'll ever go back to the forest. That cabin, which had promised peace and solitude, had almost cost me my life. I still get chills remembering the darkness, the silence, and the feeling of eyes watching me from the shadows. The lesson I learned the hard way is simple. Isolation can be peaceful, but it can also make you vulnerable in ways you can't predict. And no amount of planning or preparation can fully protect you from the unknown. Even now, years later, I remember every detail of that week. The smell of the cabin, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of footsteps in the dirt outside, and the cold, heavy fear that settled in my chest every night. I never saw the person face to face, and I never want to, but I know they were there, and that knowledge is enough to make every forest walk I take now feel uneasy. It took a long time to recover from that experience. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without imagining shadows in my room. I had been planning this solo trip for months. My job had been unbearably stressful, and I needed a break from everything. Phones, people, emails, noise. The thought of spending a week alone in a remote cabin in the mountains seemed like the perfect escape. I found the cabin online through a rental listing, and it was exactly what I wanted. Small, isolated, surrounded by thick forest, and with a creek running nearby. No neighbors for miles, no cell signal, just the sound of nature. The pictures made it look almost too peaceful, and I was eager to experience it myself. I left on a Friday morning, packing lightly, I had my backpack with clothes, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, matches, some canned food, and a few books. I didn't bring a laptop or phone charger because I wanted to disconnect entirely. The drive was long, about 6 hours from my apartment, but it was mostly on quiet country roads. As I got closer, the trees grew denser and the roads narrower until I found myself driving over dirt tracks surrounded on both sides by towering pines. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest floor, and the air had that damp, earthy smell you only find deep in the woods. When I finally reached the cabin, I was relieved to see it exactly like the pictures. It was small, maybe 2 rooms, made of weathered wood with a porch that overlooked the creek. There was no electricity hooked up, just a small solar panel on the roof, but it seemed enough to power a few lights. I parked my car next to the cabin and stepped out, stretching my stiff muscles. The quiet was immediate and almost overwhelming. No cars, no planes, just the sound of water flowing and wind rustling through the trees. I spent the first hour unpacking and exploring. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and old wood. There were basic furnishings: a small table with 2 chairs, a cot in the corner, and a wood-burning stove. The windows were dusty but offered a perfect view of the forest. I opened the stove, checked the firewood stack, and decided to make dinner. I had brought a can of chili and heated it over the stove. Sitting on the cot, eating while listening to the creek outside, I felt an unusual sense of calm. This was exactly what I had needed. Night fell quickly. Without electricity, the darkness outside was absolute. I lit a lantern and read a little before going to bed. I slept fitfully, mostly because every little noise seemed amplified. The creek, the wind, branches scraping against the cabin walls. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I didn't recognize at first. Faint footfalls outside. My heart started racing. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too steady to be a forest animal. I sat very still, listening, and the sounds stopped after a few minutes. I told myself it was nothing, tried to calm down, and eventually fell asleep again. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the morning hiking along a trail that led deeper into the woods. The forest was beautiful, thick with moss, ferns, and fallen leaves. Birds chirped sporadically, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked around, it seemed like shadows moved just a little differently, like someone was always keeping pace with me at a distance. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, paranoia from being alone in the woods. Returning to the cabin, I decided to focus on something practical. I went down to the creek to collect water and noticed some odd tracks in the mud. They were boot prints, fresh and definitely human. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe someone else was hiking nearby, but the tracks led directly toward the cabin, and there was only one set. My stomach sank. I spent the rest of the afternoon nervously checking the surroundings, but I didn't see anyone. The sun was setting when I went back inside, and I made sure to lock the cabin door, even though it was just a simple latch. That night, the unease grew. I couldn't read, I couldn't sleep, and every little sound made me jump. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, almost circling the cabin. My first reaction was to grab the kitchen knife I had brought for safety. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence was worse than the noise. I waited, straining my ears, my hands gripping the knife tightly. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a faint rustling from the porch. I froze, too scared to move, too scared to run. I thought about my options. I could barricade myself in the cabin, but there were windows all around. I could leave, but my car was about 100 meters down the dirt road, and I had no idea who or what was out there. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, occasionally peeking outside to make sure no one was near. By dawn, I was exhausted, trembling, and hyper-aware of every noise. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, so I decided to go for another walk, hoping the morning light would give me a sense of safety. I packed the flashlight, a bottle of water, and my knife. The forest in the daylight was less intimidating, but the tracks I had seen the day before haunted me. As I walked, I noticed more signs of someone being nearby. Broken twigs along the trail, footprints on muddy patches, even a discarded bottle that looked out of place. My heart raced, and I considered turning back, but the thought of hiding in the cabin all day seemed worse. I kept moving, telling myself that staying calm was the only way to not make a mistake. By midday, I returned to the cabin, mentally exhausted and hungry, but relieved to find nothing immediately threatening. The next night was the worst. Around 11, I heard the door latch jiggle. I froze, holding my knife. Then, very quietly, I heard a voice muttering something. I couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from just outside the cabin door. I backed away, heart pounding, and waited. The voice stopped. I waited a few more minutes, then slowly crept to the window and looked outside. There was no one there. The woods were empty, silent except for the wind. But the footprints leading from the woods to the cabin were unmistakable. Someone had been standing there, right outside my door. I realized then that I was in serious danger. I couldn't stay in the cabin. I thought about calling for help, but the cell signal was weak and unreliable at best. I considered waiting until daylight and driving away, but the thought of someone lurking around my car or watching me pack terrified me. I spent the night huddled near the stove, knife in hand, every creak and groan of the cabin making me flinch. By morning, I was exhausted and almost panicked, knowing I had to leave immediately. At first light, I quietly packed my things, making as little noise as possible. I didn't leave a trace of my plan, not wanting to alert anyone outside. As I stepped onto the porch, I froze. Fresh footprints surrounded the cabin, some even coming from the back, from the trees behind the building. Whoever it was, they had been inside the clearing while I slept. My hands shook as I grabbed my backpack, and I ran to the car as fast as I could. The drive back was tense and nerve-wracking. Every shadow along the dirt road made me glance over my shoulder. I didn't stop, not even for gas or food, until I reached the first small town several miles away. Only then did I feel a little relief, but the sense of violation lingered. I knew I had narrowly avoided something dangerous, something human and calculating, not a ghost or wild animal. In the days after, I contacted the rental company and local authorities, explaining what I had experienced. They told me that the area had a history of hikers and renters being approached by people hiding in the woods, often living off abandoned cabins and supplies. Some were harmless drifters, but others had criminal records. That knowledge both terrified and comforted me. It confirmed my experience was real, and it wasn't supernatural. I had been lucky. Many others hadn't been. I never returned to the cabin. I stopped thinking of solitary trips into the mountains for a long time. But I did something more important. I started taking self-defense seriously, carrying tools and knowing escape strategies anytime I was in isolated places. I realized that the wilderness, while beautiful and peaceful, could hide real dangers, and being aware of them was the only way to survive. Looking back now, I understand that what made the experience terrifying wasn't just the isolation. It was knowing that a human being could be watching, waiting, and hiding, blending perfectly into the forest. That knowledge stayed with me, a sharp reminder that danger can exist even in the most peaceful places. But I also learned something else. Fear is manageable when you prepare for it, and your instincts, when taken seriously, can save your life. I came home shaken but wiser, and I knew I would never make the same mistake again. Even now, years later, I drive past rural forests with a new sense of caution. I check the surroundings, notice footprints, listen for sounds, and I never, ever I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After working non-stop for over a year, I finally decided to take a few days off, escape the city, and spend time alone in the wilderness. The cabin I rented was far from any town, nestled deep in a thick forest near a small, quiet lake. The pictures online made it look cozy and isolated, exactly what I wanted. I packed my bag with enough food, water, and supplies to last me a week, double-checked the gas in my car, and headed out early on a Monday morning. The roads became emptier the farther I drove, and the city noise gradually disappeared, replaced by the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant bird call. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Wooden, slightly worn, with a stone chimney and a small porch. There was no phone signal, no internet, just the quiet hum of nature surrounding me. I parked my car, unloaded my bags, and unlocked the cabin door. Inside, the smell of old wood mixed with a faint scent of mildew. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. The cabin had a single main room with a small kitchen in one corner, a wood stove, a table, and a couch. A narrow hallway led to a small bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was dusty but functional. I unpacked, made a small dinner, and settled onto the couch to read. The first night passed without incident. I slept deeply, the quietness of the forest soothing in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I woke up the next morning, I felt completely at peace. I decided to spend the day hiking and exploring the area. There were no marked trails near the cabin, which was part of the appeal. I wanted to wander, to get lost in the trees for a while and leave everything else behind. The first hours were wonderful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the forest floor. I watched squirrels dart between branches and birds flit through the trees. I found a small stream and followed it for a while, crouching to take a sip of the cold water. Everything felt perfect. But as the day wore on, I realized I had walked much farther than I thought. I didn't recognize any of the landmarks, and my sense of direction, which I usually trusted, seemed to fail me. The forest around me thickened. The trees grew taller, closer together, and the underbrush became denser. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. I began to notice how quiet it had become. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling. Even the wind seemed to die down. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same, and I began to feel the first real pangs of unease. As the sun started to drop, I realized I was lost. My heart began to race. I hadn't planned for this. I didn't have a compass, only a map, but it was too general to help in a dense forest like this. I tried to remember the direction I had come from, but the trees all looked identical, and nothing seemed familiar. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air had taken on a damp, heavy quality. I knew I needed to find the cabin before dark. I started moving quickly, but every step seemed to lead me deeper into the forest. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, scraping my hands on the rough bark of a tree. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a large trunk, and tried to calm down. Panic was creeping in, but I forced myself to think logically. I remembered a technique I had read about once. Stay in one place, make noise, and try to mark your path. I found a small branch and snapped it loudly, hoping the sound might carry or help me remember the direction I came from. Hours passed. The sky darkened, and I could barely see the ground beneath my feet. My flashlight battery was running low, and I realized I hadn't eaten since morning. The temperature dropped sharply, and the forest, which had been beautiful in daylight, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I imagined all sorts of dangers, wild animals, falling branches, the possibility of twisting an ankle and being unable to move. My mind raced, and I felt the weight of isolation pressing down on me. Eventually, I spotted a small clearing. I ran toward it, hoping it might lead to the cabin or at least give me space to rest. In the clearing, I saw an old, abandoned hunting shack. Its roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were weathered and rotten. I didn't want to stay inside, but I needed to rest. I leaned against the wall, my legs trembling from exhaustion, my stomach growling. I rationed the little food I had left and drank sparingly from my water bottle. I realized then how unprepared I was. This wasn't just a hike. I had underestimated how dangerous even a familiar forest could become when you lost your way. The night stretched endlessly. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the shack's timbers, the distant howl of a wolf, the flapping of wings in the darkness. I thought about what would happen if I didn't make it back. I tried to remember basic survival techniques. Stay warm, keep moving, find water. I had already lost most of the day, and I knew I needed to act at first light. When morning came, I felt a strange relief. The forest looked different in daylight, and I was able to get my bearings again. I remembered a stream I had passed near the cabin. If I could find water, it might lead me back. I moved cautiously, marking trees with scratches and broken branches to avoid going in circles. Hours later, I found the stream. I followed it, my pace quickening as I recognized small landmarks. A large boulder, a fallen log, a twisted tree. Hope surged through me. Eventually, I saw the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me so strongly I almost cried. I ran the last 100 meters, tripping over roots but not caring. When I reached the cabin, I collapsed on the porch, breathing heavily, heart racing, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. I was safe finally. I leaned against the door, tears of relief streaming down my face, and realized how fragile my sense of security had been. I had been so confident in my abilities, so sure I could handle the forest, but the forest had reminded me that nature was always stronger than human arrogance. The next few days, I stayed close to the cabin. I repaired the firewood stack, organized my food, and explored only the immediate area around the lake. I kept a mental map of the small paths, rocks, and trees nearby, constantly aware of my surroundings. The experience had left me shaken, but also more alert, more respectful of the wilderness. I realized that survival wasn't about bravery alone. It was about preparation, caution, and humility. By the time I left, I felt different. Not in a dramatic, heroic way, but in a quieter, deeper way. I had faced fear that was real, tangible, and utterly human. I had been exhausted, alone, and unsure if I would make it back. And yet I had. The forest had taught me a lesson I wouldn't forget. No matter how peaceful or beautiful a place might seem, it demands respect, attentiveness, and caution. I packed my car slowly, making sure I hadn't left anything behind. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin, small among the vast trees, and felt a strange gratitude. It hadn't harmed me, but it had reminded me of the fragility of human life and the importance of preparation. That trip stayed with me for months afterward. I thought about it every time I planned an adventure, every time I set out on a hike or camping trip. I bought better gear, studied maps more carefully, and never took the wilderness for granted again. Most importantly, I learned that fear isn't something to be ashamed of. It's a warning, a guide, and sometimes the only thing that keeps you alive. The forest hadn't been supernatural or malevolent. It had simply been indifferent, and that indifference, I realized, was far scarier than any ghost or fairy tale could ever be. When I returned home, I told a few close friends about the experience, but I never exaggerated. I didn't want anyone to think it was a story for thrill seekers. It was a story about awareness, caution, and survival. It was about facing a situation where every decision mattered, where a single mistake could have ended everything. And it had ended well, not because of luck, but because I had managed to stay calm enough to survive. That cabin, that forest, and that night had changed me. I wasn't reckless anymore. I wasn't overconfident. I was alert, aware, and alive. And I knew that the next time I ventured into the wild, I would carry that lesson with me every step of the way. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Life in the city had been exhausting, with long hours at work, constant noise, and the feeling that I was always running but never really moving forward. So when I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, far from any town, I thought it would be the perfect way to disconnect, to recharge, to find a quiet corner of the world where nothing could touch me. I didn't know then that the quiet I sought would become a kind of pressure, a weight that pressed against me in ways I had never imagined. The drive to the cabin was long, longer than I expected. My GPS had led me through winding country roads that twisted through dense forests. The trees grew close together, so thick in places that their branches formed a canopy over the road, dimming the late afternoon light. Every now and then, I'd catch sight of a fallen tree across the road, or a small stream that had swollen after recent rain, cutting across the asphalt. I slowed down, feeling an unease that I chalked up to being out of my comfort zone. Still, I kept going. My car struggled on the narrow, gravel-filled paths as I followed the directions I had printed out. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. Soon, there were no other cars, no houses, no signs of human life. Just the forest and the road that snaked endlessly through it. Finally, after nearly 4 hours of driving, I saw it. A small wooden cabin tucked into a clearing. It wasn't fancy, just a simple structure made of logs with a stone chimney and a small porch. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and I could smell wood smoke even from where I parked. The cabin sat next to a small, still lake that reflected the dark green of the forest, and beyond it, the trees rose like walls, dense and unyielding. The place was beautiful, exactly what I had been hoping for. I parked my car and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was crisp, with a faint chill creeping under my jacket. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, and the soft lapping of water against the shore. I felt calm, relieved, like I had finally escaped the constant hum of the city. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with basic supplies, a living area with a worn couch and a stone fireplace. A staircase led to a loft where a bed was neatly made. Everything smelled faintly of wood polish and smoke. I unpacked my things, set down my bags, and spent some time just walking around the cabin, taking it all in. The windows offered views of the forest in every direction, and the silence felt complete. I told myself that tonight, I would just sit by the fire, listen to the sounds of the woods, and finally relax. As evening fell, I built a fire in the fireplace, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. I made a simple dinner on the small stove, then settled on the couch with a blanket, watching the flames dance. The quiet was deeper than I had expected. Outside, the lake shimmered in the dim light of dusk, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and shift. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how far away from the chaos of life I was. But as darkness fell, I began to notice things I hadn't before. Small noises in the cabin, creaks, knocks, the settling of wood, sounded louder in the stillness. The wind rustled through the trees in a way that almost seemed deliberate, like someone moving through the forest. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. That first night, sleep was uneasy. Every small sound woke me. A branch scraping against the cabin wall made me sit up, heart racing. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped sharply, and I froze, listening. I told myself again that it was normal, that I was in the middle of the forest and animals were everywhere. But still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I eventually drifted off, only to wake a few hours later to another noise. Footsteps. Not soft, careful footsteps, but heavy, deliberate ones, like someone walking on the wooden floor outside the cabin. I sat up, my ears straining. The steps stopped. I waited. Nothing. I convinced myself I had imagined it, that the sound must have come from the wind or a falling branch. I tried to sleep again, but the unease settled in my chest like a stone. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The lake was quiet, its surface mirror-like. I walked along the shore, noticing animal tracks in the mud. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a fox. I breathed deeply, thinking that spending the day outside would calm me. The forest was thick and smelled of pine and wet earth. Birds called to each other from the treetops, and I saw squirrels darting among the branches. The cabin felt secure, almost like a small island of human presence in the wilderness. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Sometimes, I thought I saw glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows that didn't match the natural rhythm of the forest. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. That evening, I made a fire outside for the first time, stacking stones in a circle near the cabin's porch. As I sat there watching the flames, I heard another sound, this time clearer. It was footsteps in the woods, slow and deliberate, circling the clearing. I froze, my stomach nodding. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person. I grabbed a long branch from the pile of firewood, holding it ready, and scanned the treeline. The sound stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, coming from the side of the cabin that faced the lake. My heart was pounding. I stayed still, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would leave. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, circling and stopping and circling again. Eventually, they faded into the distance. I went inside the cabin, bolting the door behind me, my hands shaking. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just a hiker or camper walking through the area, but something about the way the steps moved, too heavy and careful, told me otherwise. The next day, I decided to explore further, trying to push the anxiety away. I hiked along a trail that led deeper into the woods. The forest grew denser, the canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. I kept my phone in hand, though reception was spotty at best. I passed fallen trees, tangled undergrowth, and patches of mud from recent rains. At one point, I saw a small, makeshift camp with a fire pit and scraps of food, like someone had been there recently. The thought made my stomach churn. Who else was out here? And why hadn't I seen any signs of people on the way in? I walked on, telling myself that I was being paranoid, that it was probably just another traveler. But the unease had settled into my bones now, and I couldn't shake it. That night, the fear returned with more intensity. As I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps again. They started softly, then paused, then continued around the cabin. This time, I could hear branches breaking under weight and faint whispers of movement. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, clutching a kitchen knife I had grabbed from the drawer, listening to every sound. The footsteps didn't seem random. They moved around the cabin in patterns, sometimes stopping, sometimes circling back. I considered calling the police, but my phone signal was gone. I thought about leaving, driving back into the city, but part of me didn't want to admit defeat. I didn't want to let fear win. Still, the sound kept me tense, every nerve on edge, until the first light of morning began to filter through the windows. The next day, I tried to leave early. I packed quickly, double-checked that I had everything, and started the drive back. The gravel road seemed longer than before, more twisted, as if the forest itself was closing in. But as I drove, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Parallel tire tracks appeared behind me in the gravel, but the road had been empty when I arrived. They were too close to be mine, too fresh to be old. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the forest behind me seemed empty. The tracks followed the curves of the road. Every turn I made, every bump I went over, the tracks stayed behind me. My heart raced. I pressed harder on the accelerator, gripping the wheel tightly. The trees seemed to lean closer, branches scraping the sides of the car. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that someone had simply been using the road and passed while I was exploring. Still, the feeling of being followed refused to leave me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached a clearing, a small roadside pullout where I could safely stop and catch my breath. I got out of the car, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. Nothing. I waited, listening, but the quiet remained. I got back in the car, heart still pounding, and drove the remaining distance until I reached the main road. The familiar sights of civilization, telephone poles, fences, a few houses, were a relief I can hardly describe. I felt like I had escaped, like the forest was letting me go after having held me in its grip. When I had been planning this trip for months. Work had been brutal, non-stop, and exhausting, and I felt like I needed a full week completely disconnected from the world. I found a small cabin online, far away from the nearest town, in a forested area with no cell service and no nearby neighbors. It was the perfect place to be completely alone, or so I thought. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for the week. I brought some books, a journal, and enough firewood to last me, thinking I'd spend my evenings reading by the fireplace. The drive there was long, winding through narrow roads that gradually became dirt trails. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, just touching the tops of the pines, and the forest around the cabin was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. The cabin itself looked like something out of a postcard. It was small, wooden, with a porch and a stack of firewood neatly piled on the side. The windows were dusty, and the wood had darkened with age, but it was structurally sound. I parked my car and stepped out, letting the silence wash over me. The smell of pine was strong, almost sharp, and I realized how few people actually made it this far into the forest. My first instinct was relief. No one could bother me here, but deep down, there was a tiny unease I couldn't shake. I brought my bags inside and started inspecting the cabin. The furniture was basic. A small table and 2 chairs, a bed with a mattress that had seen better days, a tiny kitchenette, and a wood-burning stove. There was an old cast iron fireplace in the corner, and I stacked some of the firewood I had brought in the corner next to it. The cabin creaked as I moved around, the floorboards loose in places, and the windows rattled slightly even though there wasn't much wind. I thought about how quiet it was, and how different it felt from the constant hum of city life. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, and eventually decided to start a fire. The first sparks caught easily, and soon flames licked the inside of the stove, giving off a comforting warmth. I poured myself a cup of instant coffee and sat by the window, watching the last of the sunlight disappear. That night, after the fire died down, I went to bed early. The cabin was colder than I expected, and the sound of the forest outside was intense. Birds, small animals, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I fell asleep quickly but woke several times during the night to the creaking of the cabin and the occasional snap of a branch outside. It was unnerving, but I told myself it was just the woods. I was alone, nothing else mattered, and I went back to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I walked along the dirt trails, taking in the dense forest and marking the path so I could find my way back. The woods were thicker than I expected, and the terrain uneven, with moss-covered rocks and fallen logs making the walk slow. Birds and squirrels moved quietly through the trees, and every now and then I'd spot a deer in the distance. The isolation was both beautiful and disorienting. After a couple of hours, I returned to the cabin, exhausted but feeling alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I started a fire, made some food, and settled down to read. On the third night, things began to feel off. I had been cooking dinner when I heard a faint noise outside, like someone walking carefully through the underbrush. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just a deer or some other animal. But then it happened again, slower this time, deliberate. My first instinct was fear. I reminded myself that I was alone, no one should be here, but the sound was too deliberate to be random. I stood by the window, trying to see through the darkness, but the trees blocked any clear view. I told myself it was nothing and tried to go to sleep, but the noise kept coming, moving closer and then retreating, circling the cabin. The next morning, I went outside to look for tracks. The forest floor was soft from recent rain, and I could see footprints leading toward the cabin, but they didn't look like deer or any animal I recognized. They were human, large, and the tread suggested heavy boots. My stomach sank. Someone had been here while I was asleep. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, careful to make note of anything unusual, but the forest looked empty now, quiet as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone passing by, but the footprints were fresh, and no other signs of people were nearby. I started locking the cabin doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered to do before. I brought in the firewood, stacked it near the bed so I could reach it easily if I had to defend myself. Every noise outside now set me on edge. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the sound of small animals made me flinch. That night, I slept with a heavy stick next to my bed and the knife I had brought for safety. The sound of footsteps returned, and I could hear them circling the cabin for hours. I stayed still, listening, praying they would go away. Eventually, I must have dozed off, but the anxiety stayed with me. The next day, I made the decision to stay inside the cabin as much as possible. I didn't go exploring. I cooked inside, read by the fire, and avoided the windows as much as I could. The isolation, which had felt like a gift at first, now felt like a trap. By the third day of this, I started noticing subtle things that made me even more uneasy. The firewood I had stacked near the bed seemed disturbed in the mornings, though I couldn't be sure. I felt like someone was watching me even when I was alone, a sensation that made my skin crawl. I checked every door and window multiple times, barricading them with whatever I could. On the fifth day, it escalated. I woke in the middle of the night to a loud crash outside. It sounded like someone had thrown a large log against the side of the cabin. My heart raced and I grabbed the knife, listening. The noise continued. Scratches along the walls, thumps on the roof. I stayed frozen, afraid that any movement would give away my position. The sounds eventually stopped, but I didn't sleep again. By the sixth day, I realized I couldn't stay. My supplies were running low, and the isolation had turned into terror. I planned to leave at first light, but the forest had other ideas. That night, the sounds came again, closer than ever. I could hear footsteps on the porch, shuffling against the wooden boards. My heart was pounding, and I tried to stay silent, hiding behind the wall of the cabin where I could see the door. The footsteps stopped for a long time, then a faint scraping sound, like metal against wood. I realized that whoever or whatever was outside was trying to get in. I stayed completely still until the sounds receded. By dawn, I knew I had to leave immediately. I packed my essentials as quietly as possible, leaving non-essentials behind. The forest was quiet now, but I could feel the tension in the air, like it was holding its breath. I opened the cabin door slowly, knife ready, and stepped outside. There were no footprints in sight this time, no sign of who had been terrorizing me, but I didn't linger. I ran to my car, taking care to stay off the trail I had marked, avoiding the areas near the cabin. When I reached the car, I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook so badly I could barely control the wheel. I drove as fast as I dared on the dirt trails, eyes constantly scanning the trees, every shadow making me jump. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where other cars and civilization finally felt like a relief. I pulled over, breathing heavily, heart racing, realizing I hadn't even looked back. The sense of being watched didn't leave me until I was several miles down the road, surrounded by houses and people. Weeks later, I returned to the area, curious and still shaken. I had to know what had happened. The cabin was abandoned, exactly as I had left it, but signs of someone else's presence were obvious now. Footprints around the porch, a piece of torn cloth stuck on the railing, and scratch marks along the door frame. Whoever had been there hadn't just passed through. They had been watching, waiting, and testing me. I realized I had narrowly escaped something much worse than I could imagine. The forest, once peaceful and beautiful, had become a place of hidden threats, and the idea of being alone there again made my skin crawl. I learned several things from that trip. First, isolation in the wilderness can quickly turn from peaceful to dangerous if you're unprepared for the possibility of other humans. Second, no matter how secure a cabin seems, someone determined enough can make you feel completely vulnerable. And finally, instincts are vital. When something feels wrong, it usually is. I never returned to that cabin, and I never went alone into the deep forest again. I still remember the fear I felt, the way my heart would jump at the slightest noise, the overwhelming sense that I was being watched constantly. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was real, human, and horrifying in its own way. Now, when I think about that week, I don't feel the peace I expected. I feel tension, hyper-awareness, and a respect for the unknown dangers that exist in places people rarely go. It changed the way I view isolation,